I'm trying to understand what the trigger point for this kind of thing might be. What is the trigger point for you?
Again, I don't know. This is why it's a risk, and this is a risk I think we have to keep our eye on, because as you just noted there, the president has talked about this. We also know that the conflict with China over trade seems to be, if anything, getting worse rather than better. And we also know that currency policy, unlike monetary policy, is something that the president does have some direct control over. So I don't know what the trigger point is. I think it's really hard to divine a lot about this administration and where policy goes. But I do think it's a risk we need to keep our eye on, because I think a lot of the pieces are in place such that it's a non-zero probability that we could see this policy acted upon sometime in the future.
Well, Michael, could you give me and my audience a better understanding of how this policy would ultimately be sort of unveiled? Would there be any tension between the Treasury and, say, the Federal Reserve? How would this roll out? What would the process be?
Right, there could be some tension, and you got to keep in mind, we've only intervened in currency markets 3 times in the past 20 years, so it does seem kind of novel probably for a lot of viewers, but the most important thing to keep in mind is that Treasury officially does have the lead on dollar policy, and they do have a fund of about $100 billion for intervening in currency markets should they choose to. Historically, the Fed has accompanied the Treasury dollar for dollar in those interventions, so they've generally coordinated those actions. There's nothing in legislation that forces the Fed to coordinate with Treasury, but they have done that. So I think there is some possibility for tension should this path be followed. But I think the important thing is that at the very least, the Treasury can do things unilaterally without the Fed, should they choose to.
Hi, Michael. Luke here. And I was just wondering, would this be something, this kind of action, be considered, the U.S. being a good global citizen to a certain extent? Because we've had, India's central bank, we've had Turkey's former finance minister go on about dollar liquidity being poor, this being a risk to markets. Or do you think kind of any offsetting effects from the Fed would drain that? Or how would that enter into the calculus?
Yeah, so generally when the U.S. has intervened in currency markets over the past few decades, it has been in a manner coordinated with our trading partners. I think the way the president has talked about the dollar, and particularly about potential currency manipulation, not only by the Chinese but also by the Europeans, it sounds like this could be more of a unilateral risk. Now, in terms of dollar liquidity, look, I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Fed targets an interest rate. And so any liquidity that is created by interventions would effectively be neutralized by the Fed's interest rate policy. So this wouldn't be an unsterilized intervention, so to speak. Rather, should the Treasury do anything here, it would have no effect on domestic interest rates, no effect on domestic monetary policy. And some economists would argue that the types of interventions that occur in that environment wouldn't even have any effect on exchange rates, other than perhaps through some signaling channel. So I do think that it is important to keep in mind here that the Fed's independence with respect to monetary policy and interest rates wouldn't be compromised by any action that Treasury may take in currency markets.
Hey, Michael, really quick, other than China and Germany, where do you see any overseas pushback on this? And also, do you see any political pressure or pushback from any constituencies in the U.S.?
So let me take the latter part first, which is that, if anything, I think Congress over the past decade or so has been more concerned by both the Obama and Bush administrations' sort of laissez-faire policy towards both, particularly Chinese currency manipulation. So something like this may actually get domestic political support, particularly from some of the labor unions that have been most vociferous in opposition to perceived currency manipulation overseas. I think in terms of international pushback, I think it would probably be pretty wide-reaching if it were seen as an effort to depreciate the dollar on a broad basis. I think certainly that has been, I think the multilateral line out of places like the IMF is that currency interventions generally aren't seen as sort of good citizen approaches. So I think generally we'd probably see some pushback globally.